St. Louis, Missouri. In my graduating class of 50 students, I was the only South Asian student. Growing up in St. Louis was a challenge. I learned quickly not to put smelly amla oil in my hair before school, not to pack weird traditional meals for lunch, and not to wear ugly traditional clothes. I was bullied for having thick, dark hair on my arms, so I shaved it. My friends didn't want to come to my house to play after school because my house smelled like Indian food, so I begged my mom not to cook it. I made all of these changes to my life to conform to American societal standards while unknowingly letting go of my culture that I am so proud of today. In areas of the country like Missouri, where there is so little South Asian representation, the best chance we have to make change is to center the loudest, strongest, most recognizable voice. Surprisingly, South Asians represent a mere 5.4 million Americans, less than 1% of our total population. When considering the scope of this debate, it is important to ground ourselves in reality and focus on what the most effective yet feasible solution is. I believe this method is that South Asian Americans must default to and leverage their whole, complete, united identity in their advocacy to experience two benefits. First, to avoid confusing decision makers with a multitude of single advocacy groups fighting for the same thing. And second, to gain a stronger, combined political power. Using collective identity allows us to both mobilize and normalize our identity in the public and bring our issues to the forefront of American politics. This debate is centered around the dilemma of using collective identity versus separate identity in South Asian advocacy. Confusing the American public with hundreds of smaller single advocacy groups based on country, ethnicity, religion, etc. would hinder our overall goal of advancing the issues that affect us all. Two such issues I will be discussing in this debate, where I believe collective identity must be the default of our advocacy, include politics and race-based violence. First, let's discuss politics. The rise of organizations like They See Blue, a nationwide grassroots campaign focused on mobilizing South Asian Americans to elect Democratic candidates, and South Asians for America, are examples of South Asian American collective advocacy groups that are effective in putting forth a single identity to mobilize the most prominent South Asian American issues as a whole on the ballot. Remember that South Asian Americans represent less than 1% of America's population. Representation in politics is crucial to fighting the battle of gaining true acceptance. But we cannot get there unless we target the issues that are facing us all and mobilize on a large scale. Of the estimated 2 million Indian American voters in the U.S., about 500,000 live in battleground states. With razor-thin margins in these regions, voter mobilization within the South Asian community could have the greatest impacts in states like Arizona, Florida, Georgia, Michigan, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Texas, and more. Constituencies with significant South Asian American populations, like Democratic strongholds in California, New Jersey, and Illinois, and purple regions in Texas, like the Houston suburbs, are areas where a South Asian coalition could have a major impact. South Asian Americans have long struggled to increase their voter turnout, and even though they have massive power as a collective. And even when eligible voters do go to vote, there are issues that affect South Asians as a whole. Detroit and the Hamtramck areas are often called Banglatown because of their large communities of Bangladeshis. But for years in Michigan, there wasn't a ballot in Bengali language, a massive issue as voters in this area are working class oftentimes. But South Asian collective identity groups advocated for this change to provide Bengali language ballots in Michigan, which were eventually made available. Another example of a place where South Asians could have mobilized as a collective to advocate is the Equal Access to Green Cards for Legal Employment, or EAGLE Act, which would have eliminated per-country caps for employment-based visas. Unfortunately, this act did not have a happy ending like the Bengali language ballots, as the EAGLE Act failed to find enough support for passage and was pulled from consideration. Fortunately, my grandparents immigrated to the United States in August 2022 and received their green cards in December, just days before the EAGLE Act was redacted. For many South Asian Americans, the EAGLE Act's passing would have allowed them to come to the U.S. faster and remove them from a citizenship interview list that is currently over 150 years long. This is a policy issue that affects South Asians and other immigrants, and greater representation for our issues could have passed the bill. Convoluting the discussion space with separate ethnic or religious groups saying the same thing on the issues that affect us all is counterproductive. Instead, it is important to use our shared social conditions and streamline a united front by fighting these issues as a whole. Smaller groups do not hold significant enough size in order to wield enough political power to target things like representation in Congress, ballot access, or immigration law. Next is the idea of advocacy against race-based violence. In addition to being more powerful as a coalition, working in a coalition is more effective because we all face the same violence and harassment. Race-based violence doesn't differentiate between subsets of identities. Oftentimes, it is simply based on being brown. Post 9/11, when Muslims in America were targeted as public enemy number one, it didn't really matter whether you were Muslim or not. If you were brown, people saw you as the collective enemy. One well-known example is the murder of Indian Sikh immigrant Balbir Singh Sodhi, who was gunned down in Mesa, Arizona just 4 days after 9/11. The assailant said he wanted to go out and shoot some towel heads for the actions of Osama bin Laden. In the years since, hundreds of hate crimes have been reported, many of them described by police as cases of mistaken identity. Throughout history and persevering today, there have been many instances of race-based hatred and violence towards South Asians. Oppressors in these instances do not discriminate their degree of violence based on whether knowing a person is Indian or Pakistani, Hindu or Muslim, or any other differentiations. Instead, they see a brown person and incite violence. This is an issue we must fight on a united front, and we must move towards collective identity advocacy for the time being. The way that I was treated in high school didn't reflect the fact that I was Indian instead of Pakistani. It reflected that people are not being discriminated against because of their micro-identities. They are discriminated against because of our perception. Thus, we must face these realities on a united front to both strengthen our political power and present a cohesive voice to our decision makers. There will be a time in the future where we can use separate identities, but step one is to put South Asian issues in the spotlight as a whole. Only then can we begin leveraging our whole identity based off our shared social condition in the United States, and people will listen to our identity issues. This is the best way to make change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maya, for your speech. I just have a few questions for you whenever you're ready.
Sure.
So my first question is, do you believe that using separate identity is an end state, or is collective identity a means to get us to the end state of true acceptance?
That's a great question. The question was about the means to get us to the end state of true acceptance. And I believe that the battle for true acceptance will be long and hard. However, I believe collective identity is a means to get us to the goal of true acceptance. Only once the American public views us as an American community with our own cultures, identities, and struggles can we afford to use separate identities in our advocacy on large-scale issues.
Right, thank you. How does centering a single identity include smaller minority and marginalized voices within the South Asian community and advocacy?
That's another great question. So a collective identity, it's an important differentiation to make that collective identity doesn't mean homogenous identity. People can still have their own separate ideologies inside of a collective identity. However, a collective identity provides us with an umbrella term of backing for all South Asians and allies in the U.S., which amplifies marginalized and smaller minority voices that currently have little to no voice.
All right, thank you for your answer. And my last question is that, do you believe that we should always prefer collective identity?
No, I believe that collective identity should become the norm and the default of South Asian advocacy on large-scale issues like voter mobilization and race-based violence, which are currently being tackled by those hundreds of smaller identity-based groups. In the future, I believe that once the American public once again dismantles the vision that South Asians are a monolith, once we get to that point, then we can start using separate identity in the future. And once again, South Asian collective identity is a means to get us to the shared end of true acceptance.
All right, thank you. That's my questions. So we will be now moving on to the negative speech. Thank you all so much for being here today. My name is Anisha, and without further ado, I'll begin. Justice W.E.B. Du Bois wrote of Black Americans in The Souls of Black Folk. Historian Vijay Prashad wrote in The Karma of Brown Folk that South Asian Americans are living a dual identity. The inherent fact that identity is malleable and ever-changing suggests that we can never truly center one South Asian identity, nor should we. I believe that centering a single identity will cause harm to marginalized groups within South Asian American communities because dominant narratives will ultimately suppress smaller voices within our diaspora. Today's debate asks whether South Asian Americans should organize themselves as a cohesive, united South Asian front, or if we should organize our advocacy by centering our diversity, our religions, our races, our castes, and our skin colors, to discuss both issues facing our own communities and the broader American society. Before I turn to this question, I would first like to address the underlying need of the use of advocacy in the first place. The goal of South Asian American advocacy that Maya and I agree upon is to achieve true acceptance of our presence in this country by weaving South Asian American communities into America's social fabric, by eradicating stereotypes and the model minority myth, and diversifying who we are as a community to the American public. We will achieve this goal. Now, Maya tells you that in order to achieve the end that we have just discussed, we must unite under a single broad identity. I argue, however, that by permeating American discourse with the notion that South Asians are a singular and cohesive group, we are actively undermining this goal. I will demonstrate this through two main points. First, South Asian Americans are not a monolith. We cannot let the loudest, most prominent voices undermine efforts to dismantle harmful perceptions of our communities. And second, collective identity dilutes the ability of South Asian subgroups to find solidarity with other marginalized communities in the United States. I will now expand on the dangers of a single South Asian identity and advocacy. When we talk about a unified South Asian American front, we assume that this is going to be the most effective way to advance South Asian American interests. But there is no one South Asian American interest. Instead, smaller voices will be suppressed by larger and more dominant advocacies that are often from more affluent and louder identity groups. One example of this is the effect of Hindu nationalism on American politics, which silences other South Asian American political viewpoints. In 2019, 50,000 people in Texas attended the Howdy Modi rally, a rally in which President Donald Trump and Prime Minister Narendra Modi tried to politically mobilize the conservative South Asian voter base. Media outlets in this country continue to warn about the rise of Hindu nationalism and its effect on American politics. We must remember, however, that not all South Asian Americans support Prime Minister Modi or President Trump. In fact, these figures pose perpetual threats to many of our religious and national identities. Centering advocacy in a single way silences diversity of political thought from minority voices within our community. Another example of this singular South Asian identity is the one that is created in the media. Entertainers such as Mindy Kaling and Lily Singh promote stereotypes and create harmful perceptions of South Asian Americans that become the by and large perception of South Asian communities in the West. This is a popular topic of conversation online. As one TikTok user, Akhil Danani, says, as reported by Eastern Eye, if you're in America and you want to be racist against Black people, you can deep dive into the ancient tomes of racism and find a stereotype or a slur. Same with East Asians, same with Latinos. But if you want to make fun of South Asians, where do those insults usually come from? South Asian comedians. He goes on to add that Mindy Kaling, Russell Peters, Lily Singh, what do they talk about? Our parents talk funny and they beat us and we eat stinky food and we are stinky and there's hair all over. To Americans like those in areas of Maya's hometown, entertainment is some of the only exposure to South Asians that people have. Stereotypes from the media are often translated into real-life violence and hatred and create a culture of casual racism against South Asians. Diversifying voices in South Asian media representation will go a long way to dismantling the harms of this predominant narrative. For example, Simone Ashley, as written in South Asian diaspora publication The Juggernaut, redefines in her role as Kate Sharma in Bridgerton who gets to be seen as sexy and desirable. This marks a significant contrast to the dominant narrative created by Mindy Kaling, or even by white authors such as J.K. Rowling, who portray South Asian women as undesirable. Increasing diverse representation by centering our multifaceted identities rather than promoting a singular narrative in media will allow us to rewrite our reality and eradicate tolerance for stereotypes. Now, this brings me to my second argument. When we present ourselves as a unified group, we are siloing certain segments of our own community apart from other marginalized and communities of color. Presenting a united front perpetuates the assumption that all South Asians are members of privileged groups. This undermines efforts of those who are systemically oppressed by class, caste, or other factors. One example of this is caste solidarity in history. In 1946, B.R. Ambedkar wrote in a letter to W.E.B. Du Bois, quote, "I belong to the untouchables of India. There is so much similarity between the position of untouchables in India and the position of Negroes in America that the study of the latter is not only natural but necessary." Du Bois responded by saying, "I have often heard of your name and work, and of course have every sympathy with the untouchables of India. I shall be glad to be of any service." This statement is symbolic of the power of centering diverse identities at the forefront of our advocacy to promote coalition building. Now, I would like to acknowledge that there is anti-Blackness, internal racism, and casteism, among other issues within our community, and there is work that needs to be done in these areas. Still, however, Black Belt solidarity demonstrates the strategic capacity and impact that centering our diverse identities and advocacy can have. So ultimately today, I have offered you a nuanced idea of identity and advocacy that addresses smaller, unrepresented, and oppressed segments of the South Asian American community. As we have seen in politics and in entertainment, loud and dominant voices overshadow the voices of who we need to hear the most. Furthermore, centering subsets of South Asian identities allows for solidarity among working class and marginalized communities. Collective identity can never capture and promote the diversity of South Asian identity in the United States. It is for these reasons that I believe that South Asian Americans should not center a singular identity in our advocacy. And I am ready for questions from Maya.
Awesome. That was a great speech, Anisha. I just have a few questions for you. So my first question is, why can't we use collective identity as a means to get to separate identity-based advocacy?
Yeah, so collective identity presupposes what we are willing to tolerate from the American public. By the time we reach a point where we can even start to think about what you're advocating for, we will have saturated people's minds in this country with the idea of a singular identity. By then, it'll just be too late.
Okay, great, thank you. In your third argument, you argue that smaller South Asian identity-based groups must create solidarity with minority-based groups. So why couldn't a South Asian advocacy-based group be effective in creating those coalitions?
Absolutely. So there is simply a more shared experience of oppression with some people than with others. And we can't ignore the intersectionality that people have and what identities they relate to the most. Furthermore, we have to consider who we are as a collective in relation to who we are as individual oppressed communities within our own community. There are a lot of people who harbor Islamophobia or casteism or colorism within their mindsets within our own community, and that can undermine impacts for solidarity.
Thank you. My last question is, by splitting our identity into small groups that represent fractions of 1% of South Asians in the US population, do you think that those groups wield enough political power to make their voices and issues heard?
Absolutely, and they do so in unique ways that a collective South Asian group can't. This provides certain communities with the unique leverage to unite with other individuals. For example, South Asians are not the only Muslims in this country, but they can leverage their religion to more effectively create solidarity and coalitions with other Muslims in this country to advance goals against Islamophobia.
Thank you. All right, so I'm now going to be giving the rebuttal speech, still the affirmative side. Okay. When considering any political issue, reality and feasibility are the most important factors. The reality of South Asian perception in the US is that we are already such a small population and our voices are being oppressed. Assuming that separate identities are more powerful than the collective is wishful thinking and does not account for the reality that South Asian Americans do not have a large societal backing that other groups may have already. In this speech, I will be talking about arguments presented by both Anisha and I, affirming my own and dismantling the rest. Anisha first says that South Asians are not a monolith, and I agree. But when she says that centering our advocacy around a united front undermines efforts to dismantle harmful perceptions in our communities, I disagree for two reasons. First, as I just stated, collective identity does not signal a homogeneous group of political ideologies. Rather, it gives all the smaller groups a united political base to fall back on. Fighting for countrywide issues we face under the labels of Sikh issues, Pakistani issues, Bangladeshi issues, etc., dilutes our strength and divides us further. As put by the International Encyclopedia of Social and Behavioral Sciences, the collective shared sense of we is animating and mobilizing cognitively, emotionally, and sometimes morally. The shared perceptions and feelings of a common cause, threat, or fate that constitute the shared sense of we motivate people to act together in the name of or the sake of interests of the collectivity. So what this tells us is that the collective sense of we does not have anything to do with changing people's beliefs. Different South Asian advocacy groups can advocate to mobilize both Democrats and Republicans, such as groups like They See Blue, under the umbrella term of South Asian American. And by using this term, it gives each group more strength based on their entire population of South Asians, not just one specific identity. Secondly, dominant narratives are non-exclusive to South Asians. It is important to acknowledge that the Hindu nationalism example Anisha gives is not just a small single advocacy issue. It is a wide-scale threat to the entire South Asian voter base. However, a default collective identity will not allow any more space for dominant narratives to perpetuate any more than the effect that they have in our current society in America. Anisha also mentions the Trump Party, a party who has arguably, on a larger scale, done the same thing to conservative voters as Modi did to South Asian voters, belittled their public perception. This is just the nature of our political system and will not change unless deep structural change is made. Lastly, on the point of dominant narratives, collective identity doesn't neglect smaller marginalized or minority groups. It amplifies them. Defaulting to a united coalition creates momentum to make each ideology stronger in a world where existing voices are silenced. Next, she talks about media and entertainment representations. This is a very important point to bring up, and I first want to thank her for talking about this. For many South Asian young girls, including myself, these harmful stereotypes have permeated themselves in our way of thinking and self-image. Additionally, I experienced the hatred and casual racism that she brings up that are created by those prominent South Asian influencers. However, when Anisha says that presenting a united front would amplify those stereotypes and dominant narratives, I don't agree. Separate identities would undermine the power we have as South Asians to battle against those harmful stereotypes. In an issue such as media representation, which perpetuates oppression across the minds of all South Asians as well as non-South Asians in this country, we must fight this issue on a united front because it is an issue that affects us all. Also, collective identity does not perpetuate a single narrative. All collective identity does is provide more support to our community. Next to Anisha's point of a united front perpetuating the assumption that all South Asians are privileged groups. Once again, single advocacy groups can exist under the umbrella of South Asian identity. Collective identity does not mean we couldn't have advocacy for working class Bangladeshis, fighting for violence against Sikhs, and dismantling stereotypes against Pakistanis. However, I believe these issues should be addressed as advocacy for low-income South Asians, South Asian race-based violence, and South Asian stereotypes in order to increase the momentum we have to incite change. The South Asian community should stand in solidarity with all of its smaller groups as a result of the diaspora. Finally, Anisha says that coalition between South Asian communities must be specifically labeled based on identity, such as Black Dalit solidarity rather than Black South Asian solidarity. I have two main responses. First, we must recognize where these differences come from. Remember that collective identity does not signal a homogeneous group. Every human on the planet holds their beliefs for different reasons. These reasons usually include helping their people and the people around them in their community. Thus, holding different values and beliefs is not a matter of right or wrong or something we should fight against. Instead, these differences should be understood and celebrated, not changed. This is the beauty of the American political system. Despite all its issues, we have the privilege of advancing our interests and making things happen. But we can only advance our interests if people listen, which is why the collective South Asian identity must provide an amplification for South Asians to advance specific interests that affect them and their communities around the country, in solidarity with other minority groups. Second, not only would specifying the identities of these coalitions to this degree decrease their size, voices, and power of the coalitions, but it also undermines the shared struggle that South Asians have had as a whole. This debate should not turn into a game of who has been oppressed the most. Instead, we must accept and acknowledge our realities as minority groups and fight against them in the most effective and largest scale we can. Thank you.
I was born and raised in New Jersey, in a neighborhood colloquially known as Chindia, due to its large concentration of East and South Asian populations. Growing up surrounded by people who looked like me, who shared my culture, my foods, and largely my values, shaped who I am today. At the same time, I had the privilege to learn about different South Asian ethnicities, religions, national origins, and cultures from my closest friends and classmates. I truly believe that the experiences with the South Asian diversity that shaped me can shape how our country views South Asian Americans, but only if we center diversity at the forefront of our advocacy. Today, Maya and I have each presented a means to the same end of spreading that diverse experience that I had in my childhood. She puts forward two main arguments supporting the means of collective identity, which I believe undermine our shared goal. First, on her argument regarding convoluting the advocacy space. Maya holds that diverse identities in advocacy will confuse decision makers. This argument is rooted in the assumption that we must constrain ourselves based on how the American public sees us. This is a disservice not only to the diverse communities within the South Asian American diaspora, but to our end goal. Centering diversity is the best way to go about introducing unique South Asian identities to Americans. By keeping our advocacy within the white or the American comfort zone, we will only make it harder for South Asian Americans to diversify their perception by the American public. Second, Maya argues that collective identity constrains our power, and that is limited by current demographics. Firstly, Asian American population growth, which includes South Asian Americans, is expected to roughly double by 2060. These changing demographics can signal a future where our so-called collective identity will become even more fractured. Not to mention that these changing demographics make it so much more important to do the work and educate and advocate for the diverse South Asian population before we introduce new sets of immigrants and new South Asian children to our struggles. This argument also doesn't circumvent the idea that our opinions and beliefs and our identities are varied and that South Asians are not a monolith. These internal conflicts are bound to weaken the efficacy of a united South Asian American front. The fear that we hear from the affirmative that centering separate identities would fracture our advocacy would be more harmfully realized when collective identity movements break down due to these differences. By centering diverse identities, we are uplifting those who dissent from the dominant advocacies that we see in our communities. We are not waiting for internal strife to divide us. I would now like to take a look at the examples of politics and race-based violence that Maya brings up. I argue that to address both of these issues, it will be more effective to center our diverse and unique identities to produce more effective outcomes for all South Asian Americans. Regarding politics, Maya claims that collective identity provides a base for smaller groups to fall back on. Well, we both provided examples of a fractioned South Asian political advocacy in our speeches. My question is, which one is it? Are we, as a collective, going to support They See Blue, or are we going to support Howdy Modi? The answer is neither. We can't expect people on the opposite ends of the political spectrum to come together simply because we are South Asian Americans. And when Hindu nationalism poses tangible threats to South Asian religious minorities, we can't wait for the cohesion to emerge in order to address these issues. Second, regarding race-based violence, I believe that all South Asian Americans should combat Islamophobia because it is a violent threat to members of our community, whether or not we are Muslim. However, Islamophobia and religious conflict are deeply seated in the history of South Asia, and these conflicts manifest in people's minds today. When we haven't even overcome our internal Islamophobia, how can we expect a collective, cohesive advocacy against Islamophobia to organically arise from our religiously divided community? Beyond that, leveraging our unique identities when they can more uniquely garner support for political movements may be better suited to activism on this issue. I'd now like to transition to the points raised against my arguments by Maya. So I've already touched upon her concerns regarding Hindu nationalism and the threat of dominant voices overpowering minority communities within our diaspora. As I said, we have witnessed the fracture within the political mobilization of South Asian Americans just alone in this debate today, with Desi Blue and Howdy Modi on the opposite ends of the political spectrum. Now let's talk about representation. The increase in representation that we are seeing today, whether it's Kate Sharma in Bridgerton or the Desi American Girl doll of the year, is meaningful. These show the power of centering our unique ethnicities, our unique skin colors, and the unique different identities that we have in promoting media and in promoting representation. Now, we all have different experiences with stereotypes from the media, and those different experiences are going to have people relate to the experiences that they see in media differently. So we can't expect that individuals are going to be able to present a united coalition in terms of representation. While we must acknowledge that Mindy Kaling and similar women gave South Asians a voice in media, that voice has led to a lot of bullying and casual racism, especially for South Asian American youth. And we are at a moment where South Asians are actively changing this narrative through their diverse identities, not through a singular South Asian identity. And that is something that I would like to see more broadly applied. On my argument about solidarity, I would like to address the internal issues that go unaddressed. There are people who don't want to identify with members of different castes, members of different races of national origins in this country. And that is going to actively undermine a coalition of South Asian activism under a singular identity. We need to address those internal issues first, and that is best going to be done when we are putting our unique personal experiences first. Ultimately, today, we are not advocating for an easy goal. To bring social acceptance to the South Asian American community will require tireless advocacy. We can either choose to handle our most pressing problems, internal oppression, and only being seen as monolithic, by feeding into an existing narrative or creating a new one. Because I believe that we have the capacity to rewrite our narratives and center our diversity, I do not buy that we must maintain a collective identity.
Okay, so Anisha and I are going to give our concluding statements, and then we're going to open up to the audience for Q&A. Okay? All right. I am a half Indian, half Lebanese, Greek Orthodox, first-generation immigrant to the United States. Believe me when I say I have identity issues. As much as I would like to support the different groups out there that cater to each of my individual identities, I can't help but think about the reality of this country. When discussing such issues, we must remember that we are talking about real stakes in real lives in our country. Unfortunately, thousands of people across our communities have faced horrible oppression in this country, from oppression of speech to physical violence. We cannot afford to take these issues lightly, and we must be realistic and cautious in the steps we take to tackle them. I believe there is a first step in tackling this issue, which is using our united, whole, collective identity and shared struggles as a means to get to true acceptance. This battle will be long and hard, but the first step is now. The arguments presented in this debate are two ways to get to the same end of acceptance and inclusion, but I believe my arguments have been more feasible in implementation in American society. Issues such as race-based violence and political mobilization simply cannot be addressed if our power is diluted. They are too large. Separate identity advocacy may be effective in the future. While it would be nice to default to it and more identity affirming, right now, the collective power is the strongest. To conclude my side of the debate, I want to go back to the 13-year-old girl I was entering high school in Missouri. Thinking back to the horrible things people said to me and the way I used to feel, I am proud that I withstood the hatred and believe that it made me who I am today. I am sad it took me this long to stop feeling embarrassed about my culture, but standing here today, I am proud to hold on to my culture in this inclusive space, and all I want to do is create more spaces like this for other people to feel the way I do now. For all the other young brown girls in this country, a realistic method of approach is the only way to make change. Thank you.
and this will be the last speech in today's debate. My grandparents migrated from modern-day Pakistan to New Delhi in 1947 to escape religious persecution during the partition of India. My parents immigrated from New Delhi to the United States in the 1990s to provide their children a better life with more opportunities than they had at home. From surviving to thriving, the choices and actions made by my family have allowed me to stand here and talk to you today. As the first natural U.S. citizen in my family, I believe that I have a right and a piece of ownership in the outcome of this country, and this identity remains as central to my outlook on life as my South Asian identity. My South Asian heritage has every right to be a part of the social fabric of this country, just as any other identity does. At the same time, my story, while similar to thousands of people's, is unique. My Punjabi and Dalit ancestry and my family's experience with partition are different to those of Maya's family, which is different to those of my neighbors in Chindia. We claim that America is a melting pot of identities, so why shouldn't these identities include a diverse range of South Asian religions, ethnicities, and national origins? Why must we limit ourselves regarding how we present ourselves for a strategic advantage that simply caters to a largely white audience's perception about who we are? When we advocate for the end goal of true acceptance, we ought to implement our end goal into our mindset every step of the way. And it is for this reason that I am negating in today's debate. So what have we talked about today? We've mentioned a series of examples: politics, representation in media, and race-based violence that influence a vast range of outcomes for different South Asian American groups. We've mentioned a vision of the end goal of true South Asian American inclusion in the United States for all of our diverse subpopulations. And we've also debated how to best bring about change. In order to bring about change, we must uplift our most vulnerable in order to achieve our end goal. Prioritizing a collective identity will never allow for a nuanced advocacy that allows us to discuss issues including internal casteism, colorism, or racism, how we can best position ourselves as allies to minority groups within our community, and how we can change the narrative surrounding South Asian Americas that exists in our society today. Because collective identity will actively undermine these efforts, I am proud to advocate for a world in which we center our diversity in every step of our advocacy until we achieve our end goal of true social acceptance of South Asians in America. Thank you.